Hello and welcome. This BPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. Dani, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be with you. So my title talks about globalization, where it went wrong and how we can fix it. But one of the key points that I want to make is that globalization is not just one thing, that it's not, that there are many different forms of globalization, and historically, we've experienced many different globalizations. So much of the debate about globalization, whether we're having more of it or less of it, is, I think, really besides the point. And I think the really interesting questions are what shape or what form globalization takes. But I want to start with a bit of history and a quote that I'm sure is going to be actually familiar to at least some of you. I've heard it described as the most significant piece of political oratory in American history. And it was a speech given by William Jennings Bryan back in 1896. Bryan was then actually was about to become the Democratic candidate for president in that year's presidential elections in the United States. And he gave the famous so-called Cross of Gold speech. And the most well-remembered part of that speech goes, "We shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Now, what was this gold that William Jennings Bryan was talking about? It was actually the globalization of the time. He's talking about the gold standard, which was the reigning mode of globalization in the latter parts of the 19th century, really through the First World War, and was briefly resuscitated between the two world wars. And why was he so upset about the gold standard? It was that the gold standard imposed on the United States a kind of tight monetary policy that caused interest rates to remain relatively high, causing significant burden and economic hardship on the farmers in the United States that had accumulated lots of debt. And as the interest rate burden on these debts became very high relative to the prices of the farm products that they were producing, large swaths of farmland and agricultural producers in the United States came under significant distress. So this is an early and very telling kind of backlash or reaction to the fact that globalization, economic globalization, the demands of world markets can impose significant costs on segments of domestic society. And when that happens, as it happens with interest rate consequences, monetary policy consequences of the gold standard in the late 19th century, then you can have this kind of a backlash against the reigning form of globalization at the time. Of course, this mode of reaction against globalization, in today we talk about sort of the populist backlash against globalization. But in many ways, it originated in the United States in a very earlier period, where we have the first actually self-consciously populist reaction against against globalization, very well represented by this quote from William Jennings Bryan. So globalization has ebbed and flowed, and there have been always reactions to it. There has been a kind of cycle associated with globalization. So to understand this relationship between the global economy and how it works out or doesn't work out politically, I'd like to use what I've called the political trilemma of the world economy. And I want to use this framework to talk us through different phases of globalization and why they have collapsed and how they've given birth to other kinds of globalization, so as to set the stage for really where we are and the kinds of globalization that we might be moving into. So what does the political trilemma of the world economy says? It says that of those three things, national sovereignty, democratic politics, and hyperglobalization, you can have at most two. Let me clarify that what I mean by hyperglobalization. What I mean by that is a kind of extreme integration of world markets, deep economic integration globally, where effectively there is very little difference between a global market and a national market or a domestic market. So there are very few restrictions to the flow of goods, services, and capital across national borders. So it's a kind of an extreme form of global market integration. So what does the political trilemma say? It says that, that you cannot have simultaneously national sovereignty, democratic politics, and deep economic integration globally. You can have at most two of those three. And then when you try to have all three of those simultaneously, you run into problems. So this trilemma may not be immediately obvious. The logic of the trilemma may not be immediately obvious. So let me try to explain it by going through sort of different phases of the world economy, different types of globalization, to see how this actually worked out. And let me start with gold standard, which I already mentioned. The gold standard was a system that many people have called as a kind of a system of a golden straitjacket. And what the term means is that essentially a large part of domestic economic management was subsumed under the needs of international capital mobility and the need to maintain a fixed exchange rate vis-a-vis gold. So that is effectively what today we would call domestic policy space was extremely narrow because the demands of capital mobility, the demands of a fixed exchange rate, the demands that you had to service your debts, and then the priorities of bondholders always came first, meant that a lot of economic policies maintained by national states or empires at the time were really subject to the requirements of the gold standards. Now, this was a system that combined hyperglobalization, a kind of a deep economic integration with national sovereignty. National sovereignty was required because you needed the states, you needed colonial powers to actually enforce the rules of globalization. So therefore, you had when countries in the periphery were about to default on their bonds, on their debts, you would have colonial powers and their warships to enforce those debt contracts. So national sovereignty, at least of those at the center, was still required to enforce the rules. Now, the downside of the gold standard was precisely because it narrowed the space for domestic economic policy, in particular what today we would call domestic macroeconomic policy. It was not really compatible with a system of mass politics or democratic politics. And whenever the demands of the electorate came in conflict with the demands of the gold standard in terms of what fiscal and monetary policy you needed to run, the idea that the demands of the electorate would be subservient to the needs of the markets was something that was really incompatible with democracy. So that we've seen that time and again. Of course, most critically in history, it was sort of the collapse of gold standard, which started with Great Britain going off gold for the last time in the interwar period in 1931, happened precisely during the kind of circumstances that I described earlier with regard to the kind of situation that William Jennings Bryan was complaining about in the United States. In 1931, Britain was mired in the Great Depression with very high rates of employment. But in order to be able to maintain a fixed parity against gold, Britain had to keep jacking up interest rates, which was simply making the unemployment problem worse. Ultimately, of course, it was democratic politics that won, that the Bank of England had to give way to what society demanded, which was a more relaxed, more stimulative monetary policy. And if actually that was achieved only by going off the gold standard in 1931. Sort of, similar situation, I'm not going to talk about it, actually took place in Argentina in 2001, when Argentina tried to simulate a kind of a gold standard in one country, if you will, by establishing a currency board and tying its currency to the dollar, effectively constraining itself to what kind of monetary policy it could pursue. But that too came to a disastrous end. There's a nice analogy that Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, once used to describe what the political outcome of the golden straitjacket is. He wrote, when you don the golden straitjacket, that is when you open yourself to hyperglobalization, essentially your politics shrinks. The only political option becomes the difference between Coke and Pepsi. And there's no other local flavors that are allowed. So the options on the political spectrum shrinks because of what the demands of extreme openness requires. Now, the gold standard came to an end in the interwar period. And the architects of the post-war global economic order were those like John Maynard Keynes, who had lived through the collapse of the gold standard in the interwar period and had internalized the lesson that in economies with a mass media and mass politics and democratic elections, it was no longer possible to subject national economic management to the dictates of global markets and free capital mobility in particular. So the rules of the global economy that emerged after 1944, and which were largely written by Keynes, and with this kind of a immediate post-war understanding that reflected on the failures of the gold standard, was a kind of globalization that actually said that we have to keep hyperglobalization at bay. That in order to open up space for domestic, social, industrial, and macroeconomic policy autonomy, that in order to provide legitimacy for democratic politics at home, for each country being able to make their own choices with regard to macroeconomic policies, with regard to industrial, social, and welfare policies, that we need to put some limits on global economic integration. So this came to be known as the Bretton Woods Compromise, or some international relations scholars have called it the embedded liberalism compromise. It's the set of ideas that really ran the global market through the 1970s, through the early 80s, until we gave way to a different kind of globalization that I'm going to talk about next. But it was a system that essentially combined national sovereignty with democratic politics, but kept hyperglobalization at bay. So this was an explicitly incomplete model of globalization. Keynes, for one, and many other economists of the late 40s, early 50s, believed very much that capital controls had to remain in place, not just temporarily, but actually as a permanent feature of the regime. to ensure that domestic macro and financial policies were not overwhelmed by fickle capital flows. And in trade, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, which was the main institution that emerged after the Second World War, actually pursued a very kind of a shallow model of free trade. That, one couldn't really talk about free trade, really, but freer trade was limited really to manufacturing and to manufacturing trade among advanced countries. Large part of trade, like services trade or agricultural trade, was left outside the rules. Developing countries essentially could do whatever they wanted. And even in manufacturers, when certain parts of a domestic economy came under pressure, too much pressure from import competition, there was a willingness to carve out special regimes that allowed countries, advanced countries in this case, to put up trade barriers, as in the case of trade in garments in the second half of the 1970s, where protectionism arose in order to provide space for domestic employment and domestic social objectives. So I've described now two ways of carrying out the demands of the trilemma. The gold standard was one where we combined hyperglobalization with national sovereignty. The Bretton Woods Compromise, or the embedded liberalism compromise of the first 3 decades after the Second World War, combined national sovereignty with democratic politics while keeping hyperglobalization at bay. Now, logically, of course, there's a third possibility, and that possibility would be to essentially give up on national sovereignty. So we could have a globally integrated market. We could combine it with democratic politics, but we can do it by essentially building very strong global governance institutions. So essentially the equivalent of national institutions of democratic accountability, redistribution, democratic legitimacy, these institutions would be set up across national borders. They would be set up transnationally. Now, of course, we've never had anything like this. The global governance institutions that we have don't come anywhere near being that supranational in the sense of being able to overcome national sovereign decision making, because that would require kind of a very significant restraint on national self-determination. It would require significant reduction in regulatory, institutional, and policy diversity, and very, very powerful global institutions, and the creation of a global polity. And of course, this is perhaps pie in the sky. Now, however, what did happen after the 1990s is that we did essentially push harder and harder on trying to move towards hyperglobalization. So we did move much deeper in global economic integration in ways that I'm just going to talk about in a second. But we did so without the required institutional and political underpinnings. While politics remained national, our markets increasingly started to become international. And it's that tension which would ultimately cause the kind of new form of hyperglobalization model after the 1990s to run into trouble. So how were sort of the post-1990s model of globalization different? I think it's important to understand that in many ways we discarded the Bretton Woods model after the 1990s. As I said, the earlier model, the post-1945 model, was the traditional model of trade liberalization, was a kind of a very shallow model, was not very ambitious. It entailed considerable controls on the flow of finance and capital across borders. Trade agreements were relatively limited in scope and provided for a lot of escape valves. And countries, advanced and developing alike, had a significant policy space, significant autonomy for them to devise their own developmental or their own social welfare state models. After the 1990s, this began to change. uh, um, the kind of trade agreements that countries started to enter into, whereas whether it was the World Trade Organization after 1994, or whether it was the kind of free trade agreements that began to multiply all over bilaterally and regionally, these were much deeper trade agreements. They began to essentially put restrictions on what we call behind the border policies, your environmental policies, your labor policies, your health and safety policies, your investment rules, your industrial policies, your intellectual property rights. So increasingly, these so-called trade agreements impose constraints on domestic economic policies. Um, in terms of the flow of finance and capital, free capital mobility became the norm rather than the exception, as under the Bretton Woods regime. So countries were expected to open up to free flow of finance and capital, putting significant constraints on their monetary and fiscal policies. And more, this was a system where international firms and banks and multinational enterprises essentially became the new rule and agenda setters. It was their preferences that was reflected in these norms and rules that were embedded in various agreements. One way of actually stating the difference between the earlier model of globalization after the Second World War and the post-91 is to consider the relationship between the national economy and the global economy. After the 1990s, increasingly, globalization became the end rather than the means. It was national economic policies that were supposed to adjust to the requirements of globalization and the global market, just as in the gold standard period. Whereas in the Bretton Woods regime, it was very explicit that the world economy was actually a vehicle for achieving domestic goals of full employment, full capacity utilization, domestic equity, domestic social cohesion, and so forth. So in that model, it was very much the world economy at the service of domestic economic, social, and policy agendas rather than the other way around. Now, we see these tensions, and in some ways, the political trilemma comes to its own in the clearest way in one part of the world, which is actually experimented with hyperglobalization in a regional way, in the deepest way, and that's of course the European Union. European Union has tried to essentially go hyperglobalization whole hog within the Union. It is the European single market model where there is free movement of capital, labor, services, finance, and a single currency for the members of the Eurozone. So really trying to achieve the letter of full regional economic integration. Now, originally, the architects of the European Union had the idea that deeper economic integration would be underpinned by the creation of a European-wide political space, a kind of a European polity, a European electorate. So the architects thought that ultimately the European economic integration would be complemented with European politics, a kind of a political union within the European Union. So in terms of the original image of the architects, where it made sense was that the ultimate goal was to achieve what's here on the upper right-hand side of this trilemma, kind of a fiscal and political union that would combine a democratic politics European-wide with a European economic single market, where national sovereignty would essentially wither away. Of course, in reality, we know that that actually never happened. And that's why Europeans have actually struggled and why the European Union still has significant structural problems, that it has very deep economic integration, but very weak fiscal and political integration. So I think that means that for many countries, In Europe, especially the weaker countries like Greece or Italy, occasionally earlier in Spain and Portugal, found themselves in a kind of a golden straitjacket, that their economic policies were dictated by macroeconomic policies in the Union as a whole, but that these policies were not actually very suited to their circumstances. So they went through crises and very high rates of unemployment. One country in particular went the route of simply leaving the Union, sort of the Brexit, Britain. And that was actually explicitly giving up on the model of deep economic integration, taking back control, so to speak, as the Brexiteers' slogan stood. So this attempt at trying to push for hyperglobalization globally in the absence of the requisite institutional and political underpinnings globally reflected itself in a variety of failures that we observed, that I think ultimately produced the collapse of the kind of hyper-globalization narrative. On the strictly economic side of the picture, there were always tensions between the benefits of having free trade and free capital mobility and the benefits of having a kind of a more interventionist states actively promoting economic and productive diversification, actively promoting growth. And paradoxically, in fact, the countries that did best in the post-war period were those that significantly intervened in trade and foreign investment to accelerate their productive development. It wasn't the countries that signed the most trade agreements, abided by the rules of the international trade order, or opened themselves up unconditionally to capital movements. Here, I think a very instructive example is the contrast between Mexico and China. Mexico, after the mid-1980s, really tried extremely hard to live by the rules of hyperglobalization. It not only sort of signed a free trade agreement, NAFTA, with the United States, and it was in principle singularly advantaged by being the southern border of the United States, a southern neighbor of the United States, and therefore could take advantage of the supply chains that it could join. It opened up itself completely to foreign capital and foreign finance, and essentially its growth model became growth through signing foreign trade agreements and inviting foreign capital. What Mexico neglected was the domestic economic policy component of this, which was to actually combine the advantages of accessing world markets with very conscious domestic policies, industrial and other, which promoted new industries. This is, of course, what China did. China, in many ways, violated the rules of hyperglobalization. They kept high rates of trade protection. They subsidized their producers. They violated intellectual property rules. They engaged in a wide range of industrial policies. They managed the exchange rate. They controlled capital inflows. They had significant amount of state ownership. They had credit subsidies all over. So it was China played the globalization game much more by the rules of the Bretton Woods era, where countries actually had a significant autonomy to engage in those kinds of policies, rather than by the rules of the hyperglobalization era, where such practices were actually frowned upon. But as a result, China did much, much better. So one problem with hyperglobalization was that it actually, the model of growth and development that it promoted wasn't necessarily one that would work the best. These rules that were based on free trade agreements and free flow of capital weren't necessarily the best to promote economic growth and development. The second really issue, the second area of tension is really with regard to distribution. That is that, it's in the very theorems of international trade that the gains from trade, the benefits of exchange, are always coupled with redistributive. consequences. So the gains from trade is one side of the coin, redistribution of income is the other side of the coin. These things always go together. There are always losers, and not just sort of transitional losers. These are losers permanent. So workers in regions or sectors and firms that came under heavy import competition in the advanced countries were the clear losers, and there were that became sort of the distressed regions in Europe or in the United States, and the low-educated workers in those same countries, and these distributive costs tended to increase over time. So there were distributional costs that hyperglobalization created. And third, there was a kind of a sort of the political and accountability costs, which I've already sort of suggested in my presentation of the trilemma, which was that a system of hyperglobalization where countries are increasingly signing trade agreements that impinge on their domestic economic policies and therefore domestic economic and social contracts implies a certain amount of insulation from domestic politics, because electorates want one thing, global markets want something else. Free trade agreements want something, electorates want something else. And under hyperglobalization, it's those free trade agreements or free capital mobility that is supposed to have the final word. But of course, that creates a problem, because ultimately electorates turn to their representatives. Those are national politicians. And the national politicians either have to give up and say, well, sorry, I can't do anything about it because the rules are such. Or sometimes they come up with a story that, well, we can't really do anything anyhow. So when Tony Blair was confronted in the early 90s with globalization protesters, he would say, I don't understand what all these protesters want. They want to debate globalization. They might as well debate whether fall follows summer, right? Or Bill Clinton in the early 1990s, would say globalization is a force of nature, like wind and water. So all these physical metaphors suggesting that there was nothing that, in fact, governments, elected politicians could do, because these were either the rules of the game that had been determined somewhere else that they had no control of, or that, more likely that they would argue that these were, sort of forces of nature, that globalization is a given, that nothing could be done about it, even though, of course, it was all through agreements and norms that were internalized that the system was running on. It wasn't some exogenous set of rules or like a force of physical forces that just fell on us. Okay, so this is sort of, I think, where we found ourselves in, and I think the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, rising and heightened tensions with China, in some ways were the more visible end of the visible signs of the end of hyperglobalization. I think right now the kind of the central narrative of hyperglobalization, which was that deeper economic integration would produce all kinds of benefits, that it would eventually lift all boats and would also be conducive to peace and prosperity as countries like China became more democratic and so forth. I think it's fair to say that narrative is completely dead. And we're in the midst of a reshaping of the narrative about the next phase of the global economy. And so the big question is what is going to replace it? And in the last few minutes, let me just say a few words about where I think we're headed. There are essentially, two central scenarios going forward, and I'm much more partial to one than the other. And I think by the time I'm done with my comments, you'll probably guess which is which. One path is a path of basically fixing the problems that hyperglobalization created. And those are fixing our domestic problems. And I think one thing that hyperglobalization resulted in is as the international economy became more integrated, our domestic economies, our domestic polities became more disintegrated, uh, both because of rising inequality, the erosion of our middle classes, and also politically a greater, bigger tension between those who felt they were being left out, that felt increasingly having less control, and the beneficiaries, the professionals, the financiers, the employers, who were benefiting from increased mobility access to foreign markets. So there were lots of things that were overlooked in this period of hyperglobalization post-1990s. The domestic economic, social, and environmental agendas are essentially those. And I think the key plank of a lot of what the Biden administration today in the United States is doing is essentially fixing those holes, fixing those long overdue problems. So I call these policies sometimes productivist because they really focus on the production side of the economy rather than finance and consumption and the global markets. These are sort of very much focusing on our workers, on our producers, on the local economy, regions that have been left behind, with a significant role for the public sector to invest in both in human capital, in education, skills, and health, and so forth, but also invest in new technologies, particularly with respect to the green transition. And so we've seen part of this agenda is, of course, is now being realized under the President Biden's policies of the CHIPS Act and the IRA, and industrial policy has now become completely a mainstream notion, even though for the longest time in the United States, you really couldn't mention industrial policy in polite company because it was supposed to have been a no-no. Alongside these government policies, I think there's a sense that business elites have to think and act differently, that rather than viewing themselves as essentially as this sort of amorphous global elite, where they can sort of roam around the world and in search for higher yields and lower costs, that they have to engage in much greater social solidarity and investments in their local communities. So there is the quid pro quo that comes to the surface is that business elite and employers have to be much more active in investing in their local suppliers, in their local communities, in the local workforce, in return for the variety of public goods that governments provide them with, everything from law and order and contract enforcements and good governance and regulations to a trained workforce and access to good infrastructure. Political elites, I think, in this new vision of globalization, essentially prioritize domestic electorates and domestic stakeholders over footloose companies and financial institutions and professionals. In many ways, we see all elements of this and this language very much now front and center in the Biden administration's approach to economic policy, to a lesser extent in Europe. It's very much a kind of a return to the spirit of the Bretton Woods era, not exactly the policies. Of course, finance is still flowing freely across borders, although there's increasingly questions about that. Exchange rates are not fixed. Trade protection is much, much lower today than it was back in the 60s and 70s. But this kind of prioritization of domestic, economic, and social, and of course, increasingly environmental agendas is much more was much more characteristic of the first 3 decades after Second World War than it was after the 1990s. And I think thinking of it this way also should assuage a concern that if we focus too much on our domestic politics, domestic requirements, domestic stakeholders, that this might lead the world economy in a downward spiral towards protectionism and unilateralism and a collapse of world trade and investment. And I think the reason I don't think that's a necessary outcome of this set of priorities is that precisely under the Bretton Woods era, we had the opposite. By actually helping themselves, governments and nations also helped the world economy, because the Bretton Woods era was actually a period of very rapidly rising world trade and investment and rising in long-term capital flows. And so paradoxically, when governments are turning inwards, to the extent that they succeed in creating equitable, cohesive, and prosperous societies, they're much more likely to also maintain economic policies that are going to be conducive to increased international trade and long-term foreign investment. So that, I think, to some extent, in my mind, is a kind of a good scenario. And I think it's also in line with a lot of the things that I think, a lot of the agenda that the Biden administration has already adopted. There is, I think, a second path as well, and I'm less enamored of this path, but it is also has many features of what the Biden administration has been engaged to. And in this one, I think it's rather than domestic, economic, social, and environmental policy agendas becoming the dominant theme, it's geopolitics, and in particular, competition, geopolitical and strategic competition with China that takes the upper hand. So here, so essentially the rules of the world economy get written by the hyper-realist logic of great power rivalry. So by the term hyper-realism, I'm referring to the school of thought in international relations that's called realism, which is that great powers are doomed to compete for power. And hyper-realism is a kind of an extreme version of this, that sees everything in terms of a zero-sum competition, that anything that works for the United States must be bad for China, anything that's good for China must be bad for the United States. And if you see everything in geopolitical competition terms, everything in the world, including the world economy, which should be a source of gains for trade for everybody, becomes a kind of a zone for conflict, zero-sum competition. I think this becomes much worse if the great powers act in ways that are explicitly going to be viewed as aggressive on the part of the other. So if the United States seeks to assert global primacy, US as number one rule setter, and China begins to flex its military muscles, both regionally and as well as perhaps seeking to expand its influence in the rest of the world, there's going to be, I think, a world that's going to be highly conflictual. And economic interdependence, economic links, which are, of course, very, very deep between US and China, they increasingly become a source of weaponization. These links become not a source of economic benefits, but is a source of exerting power over your rival. So these economic links become exploited in order to gain geopolitical advantage. And so the consequence of this would not be particularly pleasant. We would have a period of not just sort of a decoupling between China and the West, but increasingly a process of regionalization of trade and investment with sort of different zones and blocks being created, which I think the political cost of that in terms of greater possibilities of conflict and war, those are probably significantly even worse than the foregone economic gains and benefits. So finally, so where do I see this coming out? I think there is a zone of overlap between these two perspectives, the productivist perspective and the hyper-realist geopolitical competition perspective, and where these two sets of priorities overlap. In fact, we see significant and lasting changes in policies. So we see, for example, a shift towards trade policies that are generally much more protectionist than by the standards of the 2000s. So those policies that support the reshoring of manufacturing industries in the United States, industrial policies that support advanced manufacturing, green policies that explicitly favor domestic producers in the United States through Buy American policies, or in the case of the in the case of the European Union, green policies that actually explicitly put up barriers at the border in the form of carbon border adjustment mechanism or tariffs on carbon-intensive products from countries that do not have a high carbon price. So when there is this, overlap, of course, it's going to be rather easy to push already a somewhat open door because these kinds of policies are going to be seen as serving the interests of both kind of agendas, both the domestic agenda and the geopolitical agenda. The interesting question is what happens when the two are in conflict, or at least in tension. So, for example, if you're trying to follow or you're trying to pursue an agenda of creating good jobs, investing in distressed regions, for example, as part of your productivist agenda, but your geopolitical agenda is calling for investment in advanced semiconductors or advanced technology manufacturing industries. Now, those are two different objectives, and they cannot be simultaneously fulfilled by the same by the same policy instruments, because sort of the most efficient way of creating or stimulating your advanced manufacturing is going to be by investing in highly capital intensive and skill intensive firms in the already more developed part of the country. And that's not necessarily going to align with your agenda of creating jobs in the more distressed parts of the country. And I think when you hit areas of tension or contradiction, then I think what you're going to see is that, unfortunately, maybe the geopolitical considerations of the hyper-realist narrative might actually start to take the upper hand. And I think that is sort of my reading of what is happening today. That a lot of these domestic economic policies have gaps in terms of how much of the domestic economic and social agenda they incorporate, especially in those areas where you cannot justify those policies by appealing to competition, geopolitical competition with China. Your policy, that's going to be areas like tax policy, or areas like investing in health or infrastructure that is not necessarily linked to bringing manufacturing home, or sort of your good jobs policies in terms of working with your smaller and medium-sized enterprises in the lagging or distressed regions of the country that don't necessarily have anything to do, once again, with geopolitical competition with China. So I'm somewhat pessimistic about sort of where we will go when there are tensions, but overall optimistic that sort of this zone of overlap between these two sets of narratives may still create significantly positive outcomes. And perhaps one good historical example that we can turn to once again is the experience in the late 50s and 60s when the United States engaged in a significant ramping up of its science and technological capacity under a perceived geopolitical threat, the so-called missile gap with the Soviet Union that stimulated a significant ramping up of investment in R&D and scientific and technological investments that were motivated by geopolitical national security considerations, but which also produced significant benefits for the economy as a whole. And that would be sort of, I think, the positive scenario if we can get there. So with that, let me stop. And what I'm going to do is now look over the questions that some of you jotted down in the Q&A, and I'm going to try to pick a few of those, maybe combining. So the first couple of questions had to do, I think, are sort of related. One asks, are we heading towards a multipolar world? How will globalization be in a multipolar world? Can we expect the coming of a new world order defined by closed regional spheres of influences? So I think I view multipolarity as a kind of a given. Now, I'm not exactly sure that sort of the geopolitical strategists of the United States, the foreign policy establishment, to what extent they have resigned themselves to multipolarity, or whether they remain wedded to a model in which the United States can retain or achieve once again primacy, supremacy in world order, both militarily as well, but also in terms of the most important power, writing rules in the area of the economy, technology, the digital world, and so forth. There are conflicting signs there. If you go back to the most recent national security strategy document of the United States Biden administration, I read that as more of a kind of we want to achieve primacy. And that's what we're looking, in particular with respect to China. We want to ensure that we're as far ahead of China as possible. If you look at more recent statements, in fact, just in the last week or two, we've had speeches from Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, both of whom actually gave a much more nuanced view, which emphasized that the rise of China was not necessarily being viewed as a threat for the United States, and that the United States was not going to be engaged in a set of policies that were undermine or prevent the rise of China as a technological power. But that what the US had to do was to ensure that there was a narrow slice, quote unquote, of high technology areas where the United States has to ensure that its national security interests are protected, and that there would be policy measures to ensure that China would not have access to this, again, narrow slice of high technology areas. So many of you know that now Biden administration has imposed extensive controls on the entire supply chain in the area of advanced semiconductors. Now, U.S. administration is saying this is a very narrow slice, that these measures are very closely targeted to fundamental national security interests. Of course, China and many others actually don't see it as being so narrowly targeted. But at least I think in the more recent statements on the part of the U.S. administration, there's a kind of a recognition that we don't want to act in ways that would look like we're trying to completely isolate or contain China economically and technologically. And what the U.S. and Europeans now talk about is not about decoupling; it's about de-risking, which sounds a lot better than decoupling. So I think that if that vision is the one that's realized, then I think it's entirely possible to see how we're going to have a world that doesn't necessarily become regionalized or decoupled, except in just a few areas where there are these significant perceived national security threats in some very specialized high technology eras. And so I think, again, that's sort of the good scenario. The question becomes, what happens in the next phase when what the US did with advanced semiconductors, now you have to do in AI, you have to do it in nuclear fusion, and all kinds of different areas. And as this expands, what does this do to the world economy? And how will China in turn respond as it feels that it is being subject to a kind of a technological blockade? So how this process is managed, I think, is going to be extremely important. Let me try to pick up. So, because some of these are questions that I tried to answer in the last part of my presentation. So one question as to what extent has hyperglobalization lifted people out of poverty in emerging and developing economies? So it is true that in the period of hyperglobalization, there was a significant amount of poverty reduction, the bulk of which took place in China. So China, after the 1990s, did extremely well. But as I tried to explain, the paradox here is that China did very well in the hyperglobalization era through policies that were not consistent with hyperglobalization. Its policies were policies of the Bretton Woods type, that is to say, with significant intervention, significant violations of global trade rules, significant restrictions on finance and capital. So, I think the fact that we had a huge amount of poverty reduction in a country like China, which is really what the country that was driving global poverty reduction in this period, is not a vindication of hyperglobalization. It's, if anything, it's a vindication of Bretton Woods policies. Now, of course, to some extent, China was free riding on the policies of openness in Europe and the United States, and that might have helped it a bit. But of course, but fundamentally, it was its own policies. And so the lesson that we should take from this significant reduction in extreme poverty after the 1990s is, again, that China-type policies work, but China-type policies depart significantly from the hyperglobalization model. Okay, so it was a question, I think maybe the last one that I'll pick here, because there's only 2 minutes that remain, is what kind of trade policy would protect the jobs and incomes of American workers without isolating the US unrealistically from global markets? I think here we need to understand that, the train has already left with respect to jobs and inequality in the United States on the manufacturing front. Now, what happened on manufacturing after the 1980s played a significant role in terms of hollowing out the US economy and creating sort of an erosion of the middle class and to a loss of good jobs in the United States. But we just cannot go back to the 60s and 70s for the simple reason that the technology of manufacturing today is very different. The way that you actually become more productive, more efficient, and globally competitive in manufacturing today is by putting in a lot of machinery and automation and highly skilled and capital-intensive technologies that doesn't create many jobs. Today, the share of employment in manufacturing in the United States is around 9%. Even if the best ambitions of the CHIPS Act and bringing manufacturing back home are realized, I find it very difficult to believe that we can significantly push up the share of employment in manufacturing above 10% significantly. None of our competitors, nor regardless of how successful they've been in manufacturing competition globally, that is Germany, South Korea, Taiwan, even China recently, have managed to keep increasing the share. In fact, share of manufacturing and share of employment in manufacturing has been falling in recent years in all of these countries. So what does that mean? The reality is that the future of jobs is in services. So if you want to create good jobs, if you want to shore up the middle class, it's going to have to happen in services. And services like retail, education, health, care, long-term care, medical care, which aren't tradable, has nothing to do with international trade. And therefore, what we need to do domestically to improve equity and create good jobs and shore up our middle class and help our distressed regions are basically invest in productivity and creating good jobs through good standards and good technologies in these service sectors, small and medium-sized enterprises, which have nothing to do with our trade policy. And therefore, we don't have to worry about the costs for the rest of the world. And it's not going to happen through import protection and through Buy American policies, because it's a very inefficient way. It's not going to create a lot of jobs. So with that, let me just stop and thank you all for listening and also for your questions. Apologies for those whose questions I could not answer.
Thank you, Dani. And thanks to all of you who have joined us today. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining.